Well, let's talk now about lifting the travel ban to Cuba. Back in the news again after a congressional committee held a hearing just yesterday. Congressman Howard Berman, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, says he is no fan of the Castro brothers, but that it's time to get real about this issue. Take a listen.
Let's face it, by any objective measure, the nearly 50-year-old travel ban simply hasn't worked. The travel ban has prevented contact between Cubans and ordinary Americans who serve as ambassadors for the democratic values we hold dear. Such contact would help break Havana's chokehold on information about the outside world.
Our next guest disagrees with Congressman Berman. He feels lifting the travel ban without some concession from Cuba is a mistake. Miguel Perez is a CNN contributor and a professor at the University of New York. Thank you, sir. So why do you disagree with Congressman Berman?
Well, I think it's very naive on his part to assume that Castro brothers are going to change. If we don't get any concessions out of them, Cuba will not change. We have seen this throughout history. American presidents in the past have tried to be friendly with the Castro brothers, have given them concessions, and in return we have gotten absolutely nothing. Why would we want to resuscitate a dying dictatorship? When are we going to start talking about the Cuban people, the rights of the Cuban people, the violations of their human rights? When are we going to start talking about dissidents getting beaten on the streets of Havana, political prisoners, democratic reforms? We need to get some concessions out of the Castro brothers before we actually start talking to them.
And when you say it's going to resuscitate the Castro brothers and what they do, you mean by tourists pumping money into the economy? You think it only affords them to continue with human rights violations?
Look, they have a repression machine that works very well, thank you. And the problem is that tourists from all over the world have already been going to Cuba for many years. They haven't been able to change anything because the Castro brothers will allow just a certain amount of freedom for tourists to come in, but that's it. If they think that they are going to lose control of Cuba, they will not allow American tourists to just take over. So I don't understand what makes Americans think that our tourists are going to be able to do what the tourists from the rest of the world have not been able to do when they go to Cuba.
I have read that you said that you think this sets a dangerous precedent for the U.S.
Of course it does, because again, look, we are betraying our principles. This is a country that has stood for freedom against communism. This is one of the, again, a dying dictatorship, one of the last remnants of the Cold War. People say the Cold War is over. It's not over for Cuban Americans. Cuba still looks like East Berlin. We were talking last week a lot about East Berlin and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, Cuba still has an Iron Curtain around it, and the whole world needs to sympathize with the suffering of the Cuban people, not with the Castro brothers, and help to empower them even further.
Do you not think that because of our freedom of journalism here in the United States, and by allowing Americans to go in there, that Americans will be able to uncover any fifth violations that what you talk about, and the world will be able to see them more, thereby helping the Cuban people?
Unfortunately, even American journalists, when they go to Cuba, they are forced to play by the rules of the government. There's a lot of American journalists who have come back and said, listen, if I didn't do what they asked me to do, they would have kicked me out of Cuba. I wouldn't have been able to report what I really wanted to report. So even the foreign press is controlled in Cuba. They will continue to be controlled no matter what.
Miguel Perez, thank you so much.
My pleasure.